same topic that we're going to be covering today, which is employee versus independent contractor. We did get some feedback that you guys would like to hear a little bit more content on Bill 148, so we've got a little bit more background on that today. Caveat here, we're an accounting firm, we're not a law firm, so some of these questions you may ultimately have to bring back to your HR department, as they may have more in-depth knowledge on it, but we'll do our best and share with you the information that we've learned by working with various lawyers in the industry who are obviously been dealing with this both with ourselves and of course across the whole industry. And a couple weeks ago we were at Hicks Morley, who did a presentation on the impact of Bill 148 on staffing agencies, particularly the impact on the independent contractor community, which is obviously a community that we have a lot of experience with. We've been working with you guys for years to help support this community, and while Bill 148 is a change to the Labor Relations Act and the Employment Standards Act, it does have some impact on the independent contracting community, particularly on this reverse onus that we'll tell you guys a little bit more about. But we're going to go through some of the other issues because April 1st, part of Bill 148 is there's a whole bunch of different timing things. And on April 1st, we've got equal pay for equal work has come into place, so that's probably a big topic for you guys. So we've got a little bit of a session that we'll talk about in the presentation today about that we've added since the last session. And of course, we'll talk about the reverse onus. So a little bit about the agenda here is, so we'll start with a little bit about who we are. I know, obviously, many of the people I know in the room for years, and some of you are new faces to me, so bear with me, those of you who know us, as we're going to go through a little bit about who we are. Then we'll talk about Bill 148, talk about some of its history, some of the things that it's impacting. We're not going to cover every single line that it's changing in the Employment Standards Act and the Labor Relations Act, but we'll go through some of the key things, and then we're going to talk about employee versus independent contractor, which is really the area where we have years and years of experience, as well as personal service business, and there is a difference between those two. We'll talk about what that difference is. And then we'll wrap up with some specific strategies for the independent contractor community on how they can minimize their risk. So without further ado, a little bit about who we are. So we are chartered professional accountants for information technologists. Some of you probably knew us as CA for IT. CAs don't exist anymore. We're all CPAs, so we're going through a little bit of a rebranding. In addition, you didn't know that, eh? Yeah, so we've all merged together. CAs, CGAs, CMAs are all now CPAs here in Canada. Now, legacy accountants retain their designation, and so it would be CPA CA or CPA CMA or CPA CGA, whatever the case might be. But we're all one body now. And in addition, the other big change is that my father, who founded this practice over 30 years ago, is now 77 years of age, and he is looking to retire. Fingers crossed the succession will be complete July 31st of this year. Let me tell you, succession planning with family members is not a fun experience. But we're really excited about all the things that we've got going on. My father brought a wealth of experience and knowledge over the years. I bring a slightly different approach, maybe younger, fresher, more technology oriented. So the blending of these two approaches is really making us, I think, a great firm. We are one of the few firms that works with the NACCB. Does everyone in the room know what the NACCB is? So here, I see some nods. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's the National Association of Computer Consulting Businesses. It's an organization of all the major staffing firms, and Procom does belong to this organization. It's one of the leaders in the organization. And we get together around common issues like Bill 148, WSIB, personal service business risk, all these issues that the community is facing, so that we can work together as a team to help resolve these issues. And many of these issues ultimately need to be resolved at political levels. And as you know, Frank is very active. He's had several meetings with Premier Wynne around Bill 148 because unfortunately a lot of the attacks that we're seeing against the independent contracting market are coming from a political level. And it seems like that's one of the best approaches to deal with it. So anyone who's watching, of course, we always encourage everyone to reach out to their MPs, make sure that they understand the impacts, because I know in Frank's conversations with Premier Wynne, a lot of the impacts that that Bill 148 is having on the independent contractor were unintended consequences. Obviously, it's hard for policymakers to really realize the entire ramifications of all the things that they're trying to implement. No matter how well intended, they obviously have consequences that they may or may not have anticipated. And you know, there's some big concerns about what Bill 148 is doing with the independent contracting community. So we're also an ISO registered firm, which just means that we have policies and processes that are documented, as well as external auditors who come in to make sure that we abide by those policies and processes, and also that those policies and processes are constantly improving and getting better. So lastly, a little bit about me, and like I said, I'm a little bit different from my dad. I'm very technology focused. I've been lucky to be recognized for some of the work that I've been doing in cloud accounting. Does everyone know what cloud accounting is? A little bit? Some people know? Okay. So cloud accounting is accounting on the internet, basically. It's the big advent with what's going on with some major transformational changes in technology around machine learning, artificial intelligence, which are really changing the way accountants do their job. So I personally have been a big believer in this as a big benefit to the community. So I've been recognized as the top 50 cloud accountant now 4 years in a row. Run the Firm of the Future competition with QuickBooks the first year it was run. Was a runner-up for the Global Firm of the Future the second year. And as well, recently we've been recognized as the top 5 influencer in accounting across Canada, because we do a fair bit of work on social media, as you'll see. We're posting this all now live over Periscope, and we do quite a bit of work on Twitter. So that's a little bit about me. Again, getting back to the organization and why clients ultimately choose to work with us is that we have a full service approach, which means that we can offer them help with their accounting, their bookkeeping, and as well their paralegal and incorporation services, which is oftentimes why we reach out and connect with you guys, is because when you get those independent contractors for the first time and they have no idea how to get set up and get started, we can help and assist with that process. In addition, one of the most important things is you as an organization don't want to be guiding or influencing these independent contractors on what their decisions should be. So ultimately, if the client's unsure on the ropes, you don't want to be making a recommendation in one direction or another. You can refer them on to us. We'll do an analysis of their individual situation and make a recommendation that makes sense for them. Now, one of the important things to know and understand is we believe strongly in the independent contractor workforce and the benefits of being an independent contractor. And my father, who started this practice, was one of the very first accountants to actually believe that independent contractors could incorporate and take advantage of the small business deduction. And we've been leaders on this issue for over 30 years and have fought and won many cases with CRA. We also do some unique things that you won't find with other accounting firms, including a benchmarking analysis, which again we've been doing this for over 30 years, so we've got probably one of the largest databases of independent consultants out there. And we're able to quickly analyze clients' financial information and show them how they compare against averages and medians, which identifies situations where they have expenses that they may not realize that they're entitled to because they've come from a full-time role and they don't realize that they can deduct the meals and entertainment that they're having with friends and family members who have the potential to help them earn income in the future. It also helps us to pinpoint areas where they're above average. Maybe they're excessively risky or generous with their deductions. And it doesn't mean they're not entitled to those deductions. It just means that there's a red flag that we've identified, and potentially CRA might identify these risks. So let's make sure that we've got them documented and we can keep them so that when CRA comes knocking at our door, we've got the answers that they need. The other thing that we offer, which is really unique, is our audit representation protection. And this is really critical, particularly around issues like PSB and PSC, because the biggest risk that these guys have is they're going to put their own foot in their mouth. And with our audit representation protection, we'll represent these independent contractors up until the third and final stages of appeals within CRA at no additional cost to them. And that's a big win because, like I say, the biggest risk these guys have is they're going to say something that's going to put them in hot water with CRA. So now let's talk about what you guys really wanted to hear about, which is Bill 148, which we sort of see as the new threat to the independent contracting community. We will be talking more about PSC as well. So what Bill 148 is, it's, as I said earlier, it's a change to the Employment Standards Act and the Labor Relations Act. It was an ongoing process. We'll just, yes, please and thank you. That give you a little bit of background on it. One more slide here, sorry. Yes, please and thank you. And bear with me because I'm not that familiar with these slides. Some of them were created this morning. So the Bill 148 came out of the Changing Workplace Review, which was basically two labor lawyers with a fair bit of experience in the industry who were trying to create more protection for the precarious employees and the vulnerable workforce. And they issued this report in May of 2017, and Bill 148 passed its first reading very shortly after in June of 2017 and reached royal accession in November of 2017, which meant that ultimately some of these changes, like the reverse onus, came into place right away. Some of the other changes actually are going to be taking place now, April 1st, like the equal pay for equal work, as well as the changes to the minimum wage, which a lot of you probably heard a lot about in the news, took place on January 1st and will take place again, another dollar increase on January 1st of next year, as well as basically constant adjustments for inflations every October thereon. So it's going to have a couple dates that impact us, and it's going to be an ongoing issue. Now, some of the reasons that they conducted the Fair Workplaces Review, sorry, I apologize, is, these are the couple of the issues where we, different slides here, apologize. Back one more. No. There we are, okay. So these are some of the issues that gave rise to why they did the Fair Workplaces Review. I'm not saying these are valid issues, these are the issues that the politicians perceived. So they felt that a lot of employees were vulnerable for a number of issues, which is why they set out to protect these vulnerable workforce, the vulnerable workforce. Unfortunately, the independent contractors, as I said, were unintentionally impacted by a lot of this. There, in my opinion, is a lot of political issues behind what Bill 148 is. If we look at the timing of things and the fact that the minimum wage increase didn't happen until January, the fact that we've got some changes in politics and an upcoming election in Ontario, I wouldn't be surprised if some of this was intentionally or unintentionally trying to buy votes. But I won't get on my soapbox because I share a lot of the same views as Frank, and I'm not very happy with our politicians in Ontario or federally in the way that they're treating the independent contractors. But I have to try to stay away from that topic because I know it's contentious. Now, one thing that I think was really interesting and worth sharing is this study that was done on the potential impact of what Bill 148 can do and how it's going to affect our economy. And it was conducted by the the Canadian Centre of Economic Analysis. And they think that this is going to put up to 185,000 jobs at risk. And it's going to have an impact of over $23 billion. And despite the stimulus that's going to be injected by the government of over $11 billion, they still think that there's going to be about a $12 billion deficit in the impact of what this is going on. And I think we're, yeah, there you go. So the impact of this, as we're seeing in the industry, is quite significant. And I've seen it in the small business owners and their concerns around, even just the minimum wage changes, the changes around, the amount of vacation pay, the actual increase in cost that this is costing them to run their small businesses, as well as the impact that it's having on the independent contractor community. So I'm not a huge fan of Bill 148, which is why I am encouraging everyone to work at a political level to see what changes that we can make. Ultimately, the only changes that we're going to see are going to come from a political level. So let's go on to our next slide here. So I thought talking about equal pay for equal work is something that we should have a discussion about because it's ultimately coming into place now. So basically, as it stands right now, or prior to Bill 148, I should say, the different pay, the only thing that was included in the Employment Standards Act was basically making sure that there was equal pay based on sex. and that was the only criteria. So that is now changing, and obviously from a social standpoint, we were seeing more and more move to temporary work and more casual, and you guys were probably seeing this. And there were also, from the government's perspective, a differentiation between what the casual workers were being paid and what the full-time employees were being paid. And I think there was about a 50% difference in pay between a part-time casual laborer and the employee doing a similar job right beside them, which is one of the reasons that they put these changes into place. So now with the new changes to the Employment Standards Act and Labor Relations Act, there's now a requirement that there shouldn't be a difference in pay, not only based on sex, but also based on employment status. So if you're doing the same type of work in the same establishment, if you're using substantially the same skills, efforts, or take on the same responsibilities, or work under similar conditions, you're entitled to equal pay now under the Employment Standards Act and Labor Relations Act. There are some exceptions to this. So basically, if you have different pays based on seniority, or if you have different pays based on earnings based on quantity or quality of work done, as well as any other factor other than sex or employment status. So like most law, we've got a lot of interpretation issues, which again, I'm ultimately going to refer you back to your HR departments on a lot of these issues, because there is some nebulous wording in this because of these exceptions that are in there. Now, one of the other things that I think is important to understand, which it looks like on that last slide I only got about half the word in before I ran out of time. Part-time workers are now actually entitled to challenge whether they are receiving equal pay for equal work, and there has to be a formal response process, a written response, as well as there can be no reprisals, so you can't adversely affect the part-time workers for making a challenge on whether they're actually being paid equal pay for equal work. So these are the big issues that are come into effect just right now, April 1st, I guess. So this is the first week. I'm sure that you guys are dealing with this. I don't know what your plans or strategies are on that. I don't know if anyone in the room knows about that. Anyone have any questions about this? No? Quiet room. It's a little bit overwhelming. I know there's a lot going on here, and I've attended quite a few sessions and seminars myself, and I know that it's a very complicated issue.
Andrew, wasn't there some language just around just the whole challenge equal pay for equal work aspect? Was there any language in there about having the right to access your colleagues'
pay? Yes, there was. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And so there is a whole bunch of basically they have the right to find out what their coworkers are being paid.
Yeah.
They have the right to challenge what they're being paid, and you as an employer have an obligation to respond to that in a formal way, and have no reprisals against them for making that challenge.
Wonderful.
Yes, wonderful. That's a euphemism if I've ever heard one. Now, I'm not sure if our feet is looking lost, but the other big issue, and the issue that we talked a fair bit about last time, and which we'll talk about when we talk about personal service business, is this employee versus independent contractor status. So basically what's changed now with the Employment Standards Act is that there is a responsibility on the employer to prove that any relationships with independent contractors is truly that of an independent contractor relationship. Now, in talking with various lawyers on this issue, while this has now been codified as part of the Employment Standards Act, all the court cases ultimately rested the responsibility with the employers historically anyways. So from a court case perspective, this doesn't change a lot of things. It does, as I say, sort of codify things and make it a formal part of the Employment Standards Act, as well as gives some specific teeth to the penalties when you don't meet the standard of, when you can't prove that the independent contractor was truly independent. And that's a penalty of up to $50,000 per independent contractor. Now, the other issue that we have here is, obviously this issue can arise when you have an independent contractor who now has finished their contract and they want to receive severance or EI or something, and are coming back after the situation and challenging their status, which is why it's important to make sure that we're documenting their status up front as opposed to after the fact. But there's also been a whole bunch of new inspectors hired by ESA, and the question is, will they be making their ways around to identify whether the independent contractors truly are independent, rather than waiting for an independent contractor to bring a case forward to the court system. I have yet to see that. That is the fear that, excuse me, that is the fear that the community has. It ultimately hasn't happened yet to any of the independent or any of the staffing agencies that we're working with through the NACCB. If we hear of anything, we'll make sure that we share that message with the community. Ultimately, if that does happen, those findings will be challenged in court, and that process in and of itself is going to take years to see the outcomes of that. So we're in it for the long haul here, and we don't know what the outcomes or the findings will be of these inspectors, or if they will even be going out to try and challenge this. But this is something that we want to be prepared for, and we do have some recommendations for you guys as staffing firms as well as independent contractors on things that they can do to protect against this. So now I'm going to revert back to a little bit about the tax side, because when Employment Standards Act makes a determination of whether someone is an independent contractor versus an employee, they do very similar types of analysis on, as we've always done with personal service businesses or independent contractors. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific tools and recommendations that we have when it comes to ESA at the end. But before we do that, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between employee versus contractor and personal service business, which ultimately ties into this reverse onus. So the first thing I usually mention is this guide that's out there by CRA. And I always tell people that this is a guide used by CRA, and it shouldn't be used as your guide to determine your own interpretation, but it should be used as a guide to know and understand how CRA might interpret you. Because it is, like I say, it comes from CRA's side. And the thing I always tell people is to understand that CRA isn't the one who makes the ultimate determination as to whether someone is an independent contractor or not. They have an interpretation based on various case law, as do we. Their interpretation may very well differ with ours, and that's quite common. And ultimately, it's up to a judge to make that determination. And what happens as far as the appeals process goes, we have 3 levels of appeals within CRA, which historically, prior to the special audit that went on a few years ago, we were able to successfully defend many of our cases before they ever went to tax court. And we've got a couple of tools that we use to do that. Now, even if it does go to tax court, you've got 3 levels of appeals effectively within that. You've got the Tax Court of Canada, which is where your first case would be held. Then you've got the Federal Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court of Canada. Now, our goal is to make sure that these issues don't get to that level, because it can be costly and expensive for an independent contractors to actually go through that process. And what we have seen in the past is those independent contractors who get to that level ultimately fold and concede to CRA because they don't want to go through that headache, and that then creates precedences and cases that can be used against the whole community as a whole. So which is why we've worked for so many years with organizations like the NACCB to work and fight this at all levels possible, which includes in the courts and at a political level as well. So there's a number of things that the guide goes through. It talks about control, talks about tools, subcontracting work, financial risk, responsibility for investment, opportunity for profit. And it's not that this is wrong or that this is incorrect information. It's factually correct. It is just taken from an approach of people that I think have the wrong understanding of our community and don't understand that, for example, tools and equipment in the knowledge worker environment is not necessarily your laptop, but rather your brain and the experience that you have that you bring to the table. As well as they've been lucky enough to put out a new information bulletin specific to IT, because they have recognized some of the differences, and that I call sort of the secret CPP and EI information bulletin. And this bulletin, it's not really a secret, but a lot of people surprisingly don't know about it. And what this does, it specifically speaks to the IT sector And it identifies that even CRA has to realize that the IT world operates a little bit differently. And if there's things in there that as a regular independent contractor somewhere else might deem you to be an employee, those same rules don't apply here with the IT community. However, there's some wording and language around this whole PSB, PSC, which is really important to know and differentiate it. Because as you can see, I've got one example out of this guide that they've got up there, that if a layman is looking at it, they might interpret this as to be contradictory, because I'm actually going to read here for a second. It says, one factor that may be considered neutral, and this is the way the guides go, they basically say it's either neutral or it's indicative of an employee. They don't actually have anything that says this is indicative of you being an independent contractor. It's either neutral or indicative of an employee, which I think sort of proves the bias in the document itself. Otherwise, there would be some indicators of why you're an independent contractor. But it says a factor that would be considered neutral, i.e. pointing to the fact that you're an independent contractor, is that for security reasons and because of the nature of the work makes this necessary, the IT consultant must provide their services at the payer's place of business. Yet an indicator that the worker is an employee is that it requires that the IT consultant provide services at the payer's place of business. Sounds pretty similar, right? Except for this last line is really critical, knowing and understanding the language around this issue, is it says to allow the payer to monitor or provide direction as to how the work is done. And this comes back to control issues, which is a very real part of what the court cases have gone through and looked at historically. And it's one of the most important factors in determination both on the tax side as well as on the ESA side. And the big thing about this is the way they're going to determine control is by asking questions and doing some analysis. And this is where the independent contractor has the probability of putting their foot in their mouth. And the analogy that I always give people and talk about is the analogy of the painter or the electrician or the tradesman who comes to your house. And while the tradesman controls the process, you certainly control the outcome. You decide where the electrical sockets are going. You decide what sinks are going to be placed where and what toilets are going where and what bathrooms, what the bathroom is going to look like. But the trade controls the process. And so it's with the independent contractor, it's the same. The independent contractor is responsible for determining the process, but the end client can certainly determine and be responsible for managing the outcome. And that's a really big differentiator, and knowing and understand how to use the language and the literature around that differentiator is what's going to ultimately win or lose cases. So for example, if CRA asks you whether you abide by the policies and procedures of your end client and you say yes, you could very easily be deemed to be an independent contractor. Now if your answer is no, I don't abide by the policies and procedures of my end client, but I have my own policies and procedures that mirror those of my end client so that I can be effective, that's going to deem you to be an independent contractor. And that's the analogy if we come back to the painter or the plumber or the electrician. If the painter or the plumber or the electrician comes to do that work at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're going to be fired pretty quickly, which means that painter, that tradesman is going to have policies and procedures of their own that mirror those of their clients or what's important to their client. But it's really important to know the language that can get you into trouble and the language that can keep you safe. Now, there is a difference between employee versus independent contractor and personal service business versus independent contractor. And the reason that there's a difference is because a lot of people believe that if you're a sole proprietor, you can't be deemed to be a personal service business. Technically true, because a personal service business is a type of legal entity. It's a type of corporation. So if you're not incorporated, you can't possibly be a personal service business. But you can still be deemed to be an employee, and you can still lose all of the many tax advantages of being an independent contractor and being able to deduct expenses. But a personal service business is something very different than an employee. A personal service business, and we actually go through the definition from the income tax here, basically says if it weren't for this incorporation, you would be reasonably regarded as an employee of the end client. So they're basically saying, well, other than this corporation, you're an employee. So we're going to tax you basically worse than being an employee. And there are some pretty punitive damages to being deemed a personal service business or personal service corporation. And the analogy I again use, and people have probably heard it from me several times now, is a shark attack. And the reason I use the analogy of a shark attack is because shark attacks, when they happen, are vicious and atrocious and life-altering, but the reality is they don't happen to a large percentage of the population, and they shouldn't prevent people from wanting to enjoy the benefits of swimming in the ocean. And it's the same with PSP. When it happens to someone, the impact is quite significant. They're going to disallow a bunch of expenses. Any income that's left inside the corporation is going to be taxed at a higher rate that is more punitive than ultimately taking it as an employee. And they're going to look at a multitude of years, and they're going to charge you interest and penalties. And in small cases, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars. In large cases, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the impact is quite significant when it happens. But the reality is it doesn't happen to a large percent of the population. Even the special case that ultimately we were able to defend with a number of cases through the NACCB and the work that we did there, they only reassessed 234 cases. And that's across the country. And how many independent contractors are working on contract at any given time? You guys would probably know the answer to that better than I would, but it's tens of thousands. So it's a small percentage of the population that were identified as personal service businesses. And then even within those 200 and something businesses that were identified, many of those cases were fought and won. In fact, the NACCB took on about 50 of those cases, and every one of those 50 cases was won. Now, unfortunately, many of those cases were won in something called the consent to judgment, which means they never went to tax court, which is great for those individuals. Unfortunately, not great for us as an industry because we weren't able to create precedents and be able to point to a court case and say, this is how you do it. This is what is an independent contractor. And in the presentation at Hicks Morley that we went to, they ran through the Sagas case, which is another landmark case other than the Weeby Door, which I'll talk about in a second. And the judge in the Sagas case basically reads out a bunch of reasons why this person is an independent contractor, which points to a lot of the four key concepts identified in the Weeby Door cases. But he says these aren't exhaustive, and in fact, every single situation has to be judged on its own merits, which ultimately leaves us in this gray area, which is why this issue is actually going to continue on into purgatory, and it's unlikely that we're ever going to have a clear-cut definition of what is an independent contractor and what is an employee. It's always going to be this gray area that we're struggling to define. Now, the best we can define this is by information laid out in various court cases that have gone on in the past. The landmark case that most people refer to is the Weeby Door case, which was the very first case back in 1984. And out of this came the four criteria that are used in almost every court case today, which is the degree of supervision and control, which we've talked about how important understanding the control of the process versus control of the outcome. The ownership of tools, which again, we mentioned earlier that the ownership of tools in the knowledge economy isn't necessarily the computer or the physical tools that you're using, but rather the knowledge you're bringing to the table. Risk for profit or loss, which is a very real tool that's used. One of the things that we use to mitigate that is things like errors and omissions insurance, which by definition, if you have insurance, you're mitigating against some form of risk, as well as other things like limiting contract length, which we'll talk about. And an integral part of the process, which again, is something where the only determination as to whether you are an integral part of the process is going to come down to language and literature of information that you share with the CRA auditor. So not putting your foot in your mouth and making sure that you have a knowledgeable representative there to hold your hand and be the buffer between you and CRA is critical to making sure you're not deemed an independent contract or not deemed a personal service business or an employee. So how can you actually minimize risk as a PSB? We'll start with a PSB first. And as I said, we've been working on this issue since the mid to early 80s. Back when most firms were telling independent contractors that they actually couldn't become independent contractors. And you have the big five at the time telling people that they couldn't do this. The big four now are accepting of this as a universal standard. You still find accountants out there who have a little bit of information about the topic, but take very conservative approaches and either encourage people to work as sole proprietors, which many of you have probably heard, or the latest I heard was someone had come to our firm and their previous accountant had set them up at their corporation as a bare trustee, which basically meant that they were holding money in trust for them as a sole proprietor. They thought that this was a way of mitigating risk. All it really did was mitigate opportunity and left a lot of potential money on the table that this independent contractor could have been able to save inside the corporation. There are a couple of things that independent contractors can do to guarantee that they're not a personal service business. And this time I didn't actually read the definition through the Income Tax Act, but it does actually say in the Income Tax Act if you have more than 5 full-time employees, you are not a personal service business. Now, it's important to know and understand that that specific language came out of a specific tax case, which was actually, I think, an Argonauts player who was using a corporation as a way to take his earnings and distribute them tax effectively. And he was income splitting with himself, his wife, and his 2 children. So he had 4 full-time employees. So they basically said if you have 5 full-time employees, that's the requirement for proving you're not a PSB. So there are some people out west who are using sort of amalgamated approaches to bring independent contractors together to resolve this issue by having more than 5 full-time employees. I personally don't believe that's a long-term solution that will last the test of time, because I think CRA will just change the Income Tax Act again to say something different, that having 5 full-time employees doesn't guarantee that you're not a personal service business. The other thing it says in there is about related companies, which again is not really applicable to the independent contractor community. The things that we are recommending to our clients that they should do to mitigate PSB risk, which also helps for this whole issue of determining employee versus independent contractor status when it comes to the ESA side, is to make sure that they have a strong and clearly worded contract, which unfortunately isn't used as much in the employment side as it is in the tax side, but is a really important factor on the tax side. That the work relationships must support the contract. So again, this comes down to language and literature, not putting your foot in your mouth and making sure that you're explaining to CRA, you know, things like you have your own policies and procedures, you don't abide by those of your end client. The limiting the contract base and diversifying your client base are great important things that we encourage. It's not always possible. It's also important to know and understand that no individual case has ever been deemed, no personal service business has ever been deemed to be a personal service business because of the length of their contract. And it's even less of an issue on the ESA side than it is on the tax side, because while the courts don't use tenure, as they call it, in the determining factor for whether you are an independent contractor or not, what was happening was CRA was using it as a tool to identify people that they thought were high risk for being personal service businesses. So it's something to consider, not something that ultimately makes a final deciding factor. Which is why it's interesting, because I know a lot of the banks basically put in 2-year rules, and you got to take a 3-month break. Ultimately, that doesn't make a difference with the ESA or with tax, but it doesn't hurt either. Control your work, which we've talked about. Get liability insurance, which we mentioned earlier, which helps to guarantee that there is risk for profit or loss. Build a professional profile. This is something that Frank has always been a big advocate for, as have we, and it's becoming even more important on the ESA side than it is on the tax side. And this is things like putting up a website, having business cards, having a company name that actually represents you as a company rather than a numbered corporation. And these are all sort of like layers of protection. Wrapping yourself in the more layers of protection you have, the less likely that you are going to be deemed an employee or a personal service business. And of course, making sure that you're hiring a professional who's knowledgeable and understands this issue. So some of the things, again, that we offer to help protect our clients on this issue are things like our unique audit representation protection, which we mentioned earlier. We have a proprietary 76-page document that goes through all the court cases that were ever fought and won by companies who were challenged to be personal service businesses. And we use that as a tool to point out why our clients are not personal service businesses. So this obviously goes through WeBeDor, it goes through SAGAS. It literally goes through dozens of other cases where people have been challenged by CRA to be personal service businesses, but ultimately fought and overcome those challenges. Now, the other thing that's interesting to note is that in the early days, most of these court cases ultimately had to either go to Federal Court of Appeals or Supreme Court of Canada to be won. We've actually been able to be successful at the lower levels, the tax court, in most recent cases. So that's the good news. From a minimizing risk on the ESA side, again, it's going to come down to very similar factors the four factors set out in the We Be Door cases we talked about earlier: control, ownership of tools, risk for profit or loss, integration. But again, it's going to add in some new sections which are around the detailed written contract having more importance on the employment standards side than it does on the tax side, and as well as the business presence, as we mentioned as well, and the contractor conduct, which is even more important on the ESI side. So some of the things that we are, again, recommending that people can do on this side are very similar to ways that they can protect against the PSP, PSC. So make sure that they've got a great, strongly worded written contract, which I know that you guys have in place, that you are using the right language and literature to defend yourself and prove that there's independence and that there's no control being exerted over you. And of course, make sure that you don't have anything in your contract that exerts any control. And then, of course, having this business presence with a website, business cards, letterhead, and social media, which is becoming more and more important. We have seen situations where you have independent contractors who put up on their social media, on their LinkedIn presence, that they are a project manager or a developer at XYZ. That should never be the case. They should be saying that they're an independent contractor who's currently on contract at XYZ. So make sure that whole presence that you have everywhere in social media represents that you are an independent contractor. And of course, the insurance, which we've talked about earlier as being an important factor, is something that I believe you guys already work with LMS to do that and provide that for your independent contractors. The other thing that we're working on and that we've developed is a reasonableness assessment. And this is helpful for you guys as an organization because it's really important to make sure that we get answers to our questions and prove the independence before the independent contractor ever goes and challenges us. Because if you wait till the end of the process to gather this information, you're probably in an adversarial position with the independent contractor, and your ability to gather this information is going to be difficult. We had put together an initial assessment tool based on feedback from Frank as well as feedback from other agencies, and we developed our own assessment tool with an algorithm that would basically tell you, when you answered all the questions to this, how likely you were to be an independent contractor. It's important to know and understand that this is not a tool that's going to guarantee that you're going to win your case. It's something that's just going to prove that you've done some due diligence and made an effort. Again, it's wrapping yourself in layers of protection as an organization and doing your best to prove that you've done your due diligence to determine that this person is an independent contractor. We are now in the process of revising this to be more in line with the one that Hicks Morley presented to the NACCB. We should have that out by the end of this week, early next week, with the revisions. We've got the form. We're working on the algorithm to make sure that we can still do that same type of analysis. And unfortunately, Hicks Morley gave us a great starting point with a bunch of the questions, but they, in their analysis, said we can't give you an algorithm. We can't tell you by answering these questions whether you are or are not an independent contractor. So our analysis and our algorithm that we're working on is not something that you can ever use, but it's something that's very helpful to quickly identify, how vulnerable are these guys for being deemed an employee, and what are the things that they need to change in what they're currently doing to have a lower risk. And I guess that's pretty much it for my long-winded speech. I know we've got a bit of a quiet room. We always say, make sure that you work with a professional who's knowledgeable in this industry and get good referrals. You guys have always been amazing in providing those referrals on our behalf. We do really appreciate that. One of the things that we have done is we have come up with a landing page for you guys that many of you might be familiar with that you could direct your independent contractors to. On that landing page, you will also find a discount code. We do offer a discount specifically for Procom. It's a 20% discount. Specifically off the incorporation services. We're not allowed to provide discounts or incentives on accounting work, but the paralegal is a separate company, so we can do that. So we do offer a 20% discount on the incorporation services. We've also recently revamped our whole incorporation offering to make it more aligned with the importance of business presence. We now offer 3 packages. There's a bare minimum package, as we call it, which is just that. It's the bare minimum. It's basically just the articles of incorporation. It's $495. With your 20% discount, it's $395. And that basically covers the $330 government fees that we have and the $45 name search that we've got. So it's basically an at-cost incorporation that gives them the bare minimum. There's no longer a minute book and seal in the bare minimum package. As you guys probably know, we used to have a package for you guys that was $495 plus taxes. That included a minute book and seal. That minute book was $100 cost. We took that out of the base package to be a little bit more competitive with the people we saw going and trying to do it online themselves and ultimately making a mess out of it. We do also have a more advanced package, which we call our standard package, which also includes the minutes, the shares, everything that you need to get set up properly as an incorporation, which many of these people, if they go and do it themselves, they will ultimately have to get someone, whether it's a lawyer or an accountant, to prepare these for them. And usually that will be far more than $795 when they get them done separately. And then lastly, we have what we are calling our independent contractor package. The big difference in what we're offering in this package is we're offering all the bells and whistles in the standard package, as well as a website, business cards, and letterhead, which we're thinking is really important for these guys. It's low-hanging fruit, it's easy. So we're now offering that available for the independent contractors who aren't willing to invest the time to do it themselves. Lastly, I will also note that we are putting on a series of webinars and sessions for these independent contractors on how to create their own websites, on how to create their own business cards, so that those people who are cost conscious, let's call it, have a way to be able to do this and be able to make sure that they're creating a business presence that represents them as an independent contractor. So thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to speak. Does anyone have any questions?
You mentioned that CRA started to look at tools as the knowledge somebody brings to the table. Is that just what we're suggesting, or has there been CRA actually saying that they agree with that?
It's actually, again, ultimately more the court cases that are determining this, less from CRA. There is some information in that CPP bulletin which indicates that there is some understanding that using the tools that the client provides in an IT situation is not a determination. They would call it a neutral factor rather than a determining factor that you're an employee. So in that bulletin, there is some information around that, which leads us down that direction. They don't clearly say, if you're an independent contractor, your tools are your knowledge. Yeah. They just basically say, if you're using tools of the end client, we don't determine that to be a determining factor that you are an employee.
Interesting. So how would they, if that's specific to IT, like a lot of my clients are professional services folks and they have very specialized knowledge to bring to the table, which is why they're being brought on contract, but they're not IT specific. It sounds like that bulletin was pretty specific to IT.
It was pretty specific to IT, but keep in mind that you might have non-IT specific people working at IT-based organizations. Yeah. And basically, again, this is being an information bulletin used by CRA. Hopefully those CRA auditors who are aware of it will interpret and analyze and go, okay, well, if there's rules in place for IT organizations that require control and supervision, then any large organization like a bank or another organization like Canadian Tire or Shoppers are going to have similar types of requirements in place that would band across all knowledge workers. But there's nothing that says that. You just have to hope that you're getting an auditor that's reasonable.
Yeah.
I have one question. The Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, is this retroactive or is it like on a going forward?
It's as of April 1st.
So if somebody says, I've been working for this company for a year and I know somebody that works with me that gets paid more doing the same job, can they go back and say, well, for the last year, or is it just on a going forward basis you have to pay everyone of equal work the same?
So it is my understanding, again, double check with your HR department, it is my understanding that it's go forward only.
Okay.
So as of April 1st, they can't challenge historically. There wasn't a requirement prior to April 1st for there to be equal pay. So it's as of April 1st forward, is my understanding. But again, accountant, not a lawyer.
Right.
So this bill basically is not affecting the ICs from the perspective that they don't have to change any practices what they are doing. It is more about the people who are hiring those ICs. Is that correct?
That is correct, with the exception of the fact that if the ICs don't change some of their behaviors to make them more aligned, because you're going to start to see agencies who are doing things like this assessment test and basically qualifying these independent contractors before they place them. And if these people aren't doing things that are setting them up to be deemed independent contractors, they won't be given the opportunity to present for a job or to be placed in a job.
They would be considered more towards the employer rather than the employee rather than the ICs.
Yeah, and it will become a risk that the agencies aren't willing to take, and so they will ultimately say, sorry, we won't place you as an independent. If you want a full-time role here, fine, but until you set up a website, until you give me your GST number, until you show me your articles of incorporation, until you, show me that you are truly independent, I'm not going to place you.
Which is what happened in the US, right?
Yeah. And there's no requirement yet to do that formally, but it's the trend that we're seeing the feedback from what the agencies are ultimately going to be doing. I know a number of the other agencies are already doing it. They're putting in some form, and they are all doing slightly different interpretations. Some are more conservative, some are more aggressive, and ultimately Procom's got to find where they want to find their own feet. But I would assume that you're going to do some form of assessment in your onboarding process that gathers a bunch of information. And I know in my discussions with Frank, his belief is basically you really should have a business presence, as we talk around, a website, business name, you should have insurance. And there's a couple of key things that I think you'll probably ultimately land on. I don't know what the answer to that is. That's a decision you guys are going to have to make as an organization. But you'll probably ultimately at some point start turning people away who want to take independent contractors. You'll turn them away because it's too much of a risk for you as an organization.
That's why we have the minimum of $40 an hour now. It's exactly the first
Yeah. Oh, yes. We've also got a new social media power list out that we'll be formally announcing at the Access Conference in May. You guys are number 2 on that list, so congratulations. Yeah, behind Kevin, who I think is actually out of the industry now.
No, his wife's the CEO now of Eagle, so he's a figurehead there.
He's a figurehead.
But very active.
Yeah.
Bullshit, Andrew.
Yeah. You guys are close behind. It's only 2 PowerPoints. I think you can get it out. Start tweeting now.
I actually don't think I follow anything Procom.
Well, it's actually, interestingly enough, this industry, who's built so much off LinkedIn, is just not very active socially on Twitter. It's such a missed opportunity in my mind.
Yeah.
And there's some people who are doing a really good job out, particularly out west, and I've seen some really interesting stuff. Now, FYI, do much better on this list when you like us.
Got it.
Do you do this webinar often? Like, is it a schedule that people could log into?
We do one very similar to this, a little less content on the Bill 148 every month right now. So we're doing it every single month until the demand dries up.
Yeah.
Because there's so many agencies are trying to figure out what they're going to do. Which is, the funny thing is this reverse onus has been in place since November.
Yeah.
It's not new.
No.
But a lot of people are still struggling to find their feet. A lot of end clients really aren't aware of it, and the independent contracting community certainly isn't. So a lot is going to take place over the next couple of years into how this shakes up. Yeah. And it'll be really interesting to see if ultimately anyone has ever assessed who's done this onboarding process and whether that onboarding process proves to be the due diligence that's required. And that's going to be years before we know that. Any other questions?
One quick one. Have you replaced your passport since your last visit to New Orleans?
No, I haven't. That's an inside joke.
That's what
I feel like you need to share.
Let's just say my wife didn't want me going to New Orleans with a bunch of guys for a bachelor party. That's all I'm going to say.
Oh. That's for the weekend.
Yeah.
That was good.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Really good. Thank you.
Grab some more pizza.
Yeah, no kidding.